Really pleased that this panel will be chaired by Jeni Tennison, who until recently was the ODI's Vice President and Chief Strategy Officer and has recently moved on to found her own organisation called Connected by Data. Jeni joins us today with one of her many other hats on, so as the co-chair of the Data Governance Working Group at the Global Partnership on AI. And Jeni's guests are Claudia Juech from the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation and Kasia Odrozek from the Mozilla Foundation. Over to you, Jeni.
Thanks very much, Jack. So yes, I'm Jeni Tennison, and as Jack mentioned, I am founder of a new initiative called Connected by Data, which seeks to put community at the heart of data narratives, practices and policy. But I'm also the co-chair of the Data Governance Working Group at the Global Partnership on AI, where we've been working with the ODI and also with the APTI Institute to examine the role of data trust in climate change. So we've seen through that work and also at this event lots of examples of data institutions at varying different stages of development in different domains and needing different kinds of support. So in this final session, I'm going to be joined by Claudia and by Kasia, and we're going to turn to thinking about what's needed to help data institutions to succeed and help them to really operate well. So before we get into the discussion and the detail, Claudia, can you just give us a brief introduction to yourself and an overview about what you do at the McGovern Foundation, particularly around data institutions?
Absolutely, and thanks for having me, Jeni. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Claudia Juech. I'm the Vice President of Data and Society at the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation. And the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation was created a few years ago, and our mission is to advance the use of data and AI as a contribution to creating thriving, equitable and sustainable societies globally. So what does that mean? I think we are one of the few foundations that really focus solely on the use of data and AI, and beyond kind of funding data and AI projects, which also a lot of other foundations do, we are really committed to building the ecosystem for the positive use of data and AI, the use for social and environmental impact. So in foundation language, that's often called building a field or kind of creating an ecosystem, and clearly data institutions are a critical aspect of that to nurture and accelerate that a lot of organizations can do data work that benefits people and the environment, but also that all people are really part of developing and shaping solutions these tools and approaches. And so examples of organizations that we have supported are WRI or the Urban Institute or Aid Data, but also ODI as a policy and research organization. My own work is maybe a little bit differently than what you might expect. I am a grant maker, but I'm also working with a team to provide technical assistance. So we are one of the few organizations in the foundation world who have our own technical team, and we are not focused on one technology, but we are kind of supporting a wider range of technologies, but bring deep expertise from a technological perspective with a team of data engineers and data scientists. And so that means that we help with issues around developing a data architecture, cloud computing, data modeling, but also security aspects, good data management. That is fairly unique in the sector. We do it through two programs, an accelerator program that is about a year long, where we do proof of concept with organizations, but also through multi-year partnerships. And that's particularly relevant for data institutions that are kind of either want to level up or kind of, organizations who are at the brink and want to be getting there. Last point that I want to make as part of my introduction is the technology, I think, is an important enabler, but clearly it's not only about technology. I think so many other things need to be in place for data really to lead to effective and good decision making.
Thanks very much, Claudia. So similarly, Kasia, who are you and what are you up to at the Mozilla Foundation?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me and congratulations on the great event. My name is Kasia Odrozek. I'm the director of the Insights team at Mozilla Foundation. My team does research, but Mozilla as a whole, as you might be familiar with, is behind the Firefox browser and the Pocket, VPN, and other technologies that we develop on the corporation side, while the Mozilla Foundation does more programmatic work towards the so-called internet health and trustworthy AI. We do a lot of advocacy. We have a fellowships and grant making team. We also do research, and we also experiment with different innovative approaches in terms of products. And this is what I'm going to focus on today. So Mozilla Foundation's interest in the data governance space is about the power shift, right? In the data economy, power shifts away from where it is right now, which big tech who benefit from the data that is actually ours, solely benefit from it, and towards users, individual users, or be it communities or public good. And we encourage experimentation while building on privacy towards more agency that goes even beyond the initial consent, and to harnessing the benefits. And as I said, we see this also as a building block towards a trustworthy AI, as AI, of course, as we know, is fueled by huge data sets. So what do we do concretely around that? We created a so-called Data Futures Lab, which is an experimental kind of incubator-like space to instigate and test new approaches. The main function right now is the grant making. We have a so-called 2 streams of funding, so to say. We have a prototype fund. Right now, we are at the stage of a second cohort. We have 4 wonderful companies or projects who are experimenting with a well-defined problem within the data stewardship and data governance space. And they regularly meet. We make connections for them, and we're trying to create an environment that's conducive to this experimentation, makes things easier for them. And soon we'll be also launching the second stream of funding, which is the infrastructure fund, which is more geared toward investing the structural strategic requirements for the field, such as in the legal and tech space, such as, for example, standardized contracts or legal frameworks, or tooling for differential privacy, tooling around data management, and so on, that can be then open source and deployed for the whole field to kind of reuse and so accelerate the whole field, so that we don't reinvent the wheel. So these are just 2 streams of funding. At the same time, my team, the Insights team, we support the Data Futures Lab with research. We do research for the whole foundation, but especially for the Data Futures Lab, as the Data Futures Lab was kind of as its inception, we did a landscape analysis to understand the whole field. I'm happy to share the links later. We looked at the ecosystem of support. We also did a kind of speculative scenario of what might go wrong to kind of keep us on track, since this is a new field. And just recently, we ran a survey also around the needs of builders. That's how we call the innovators in the space, and we're working on a legal playbook that will help builders navigate the existing regulation. So I'll stop here. That's where we are right now.
Yeah, whole span of activity. So I'll stick with you, Kasia, because I know that you do work directly with a variety of different types of data institutions, and I wondered if you'd reflect on what you're learning about what they need from organizations like yours, and perhaps a reflection on what you're not able to provide yourselves.
Right. Yes, so we're learning a lot, and we learned both in terms of like interacting with our cohort, but at the same time, while we were doing research, we actually interviewed people who build. So I will kind of summarize from both of the sources. So I think number one is the kind of typical challenges of a kind of growing company, of like innovating company, and typical to the space, which is need for expertise, technical expertise with data management, such as anonymization, storage, processing, and so on. and this help with hiring talent, engineering talent. There's so much competition out there, and big tech is able to pay like mind-blowing amounts of money. So how do we help this organization hire people who are engineers with expertise? It's usually really specific and expensive. And the other need, by far, one of the people that people most struggle with is the legal uncertainty, or navigating the kind of like legal requirements around compliance with data protection, for example, or licensing, or terms of use, or data sharing agreements, and so on. So there's a lot of very specific legal problems that arise once you try to build this. And this, again, specific and expensive expertise. So we're trying to help here with connecting them to legal clinics, for example. In the US, we have a example there, or like pro bono programs, or of course, like if you give someone funding, then they're able to pay for an actual lawyer. But I think here that speaks again to this need for actual infrastructure on some templates. Whatever we are able to standardize and template will accelerate much more than just our cohort. Another need that kind of appeared is the need for community and peer learning. So what we discovered is through workshops that we run, also through the cohort, that people sometimes don't see themselves yet as part of the same field or a bigger effort, because they come at the problem from different directions, and coming together and seeing someone either maybe in a different geography or working in a different sector, but from a similar like conceptual angle, enables them to exchange thoughts and help each other, even like without us. So even creating that space there is great. And we had an example in the last cohort where Consumer Reports was in our cohort, working with data access requests, and then workers info exchange in the UK, working with subject actor requests in the UK with two different geographies, kind of the same legal mechanism, but a bit of a different use case. And they started having many conversations there. So I think this will happening more and more. Another thing that we heard in the research is that the kind of creating the spotlight with regulators, because usually the people who sit in the round tables or talk to regulators kind of individually are the ones from the big tech and the ones who have money for lobbying and so on. So us as an organization who very often have access to regulators in that way, like giving the spotlights to these companies so that they can actually talk about their work and what they need in terms of changes. That's another thing that we could do. I think there is also something to be said about the market readiness and awareness, because I mean there would be no success without the actual demand, and this is still very niche and very starting. And I think the language that we use in this space is very confusing and not even like consistent. So imagining that people out there, and we at Mozilla look a lot at the consumer kind of technology, would be like jumping on that problem statement without understanding it is pretty like that's not going to happen. So help with creating a space for demand by running like awareness campaigns or framing what is it that actually that we want to achieve and how will it be better for users. That will help create the demand for those who build the things. And finally, of course, it's always about money. So the funding is about helping to grow and scale these platforms, because they are up against sometimes very often, for example, in our case, in the rideshare app, we have a driver's co-op from New York City in our cohort, and they are up against Uber. Like that's the actual competition here. While they have a data co-op, while they run their own algorithm, they're trying to do innovation and a good thing. But if they're not going to get like funding, like proper funding, and not only from us, but from like an array of different investors and philanthropy, it would be very hard for them to get to the level of like sustainability where they'll be even have a chance to compete and make a mark. So as always, it's about the money too. So I'll stop here.
Thanks, Kasia. So talking about money, I think I should move on to Claudia then. Obviously, as a funder, that's one of the things that you can provide. But I know you've also spoken about how you support existing civil society organisations with their data practices and are supporting them to actually become data institutions. So existing organisations becoming data institutions rather than starting things from scratch. So I wondered if you'd reflect a bit on your experience around that and the kinds of challenges that those organisations need support with. You're muted, I think, Claudia. Still kind. Oh, there you are.
No, yet now you can hear me. Still happens 3 years in, but I think my remarks will build nicely on what Kasia was talking about, and maybe present a little bit the flip side. This is a very young field still, and there's definitely room for both, for startups that are disrupting and kind of bringing new approaches to working with data in the nonprofit space. But I think there's also huge potential for existing nonprofits, especially if they are already representing, let's say, alliances, associations, networked organizations. So they are representing not only themselves, but a significant number of nonprofit organizations. I mean, when we work with these organizations or interacting with these organizations, we are hearing there might be opportunities to pool data, to bring data together. Often these organizations already receiving data streams from their members or from the organizations that are part of their network. But at the moment, they are using those data more for example, evaluative purposes. There is kind of limited use that's being made of some of the assets that they are receiving. And I believe there's much more potential that can be harnessed, because these organizations, they are already kind of at the core of a network. So they have kind of that influence. But secondly, they have credibility. They understand the use cases. They understand the data. They understand the kind of the subject matter domain. So they have a lot going for them. But it's not easy. I mean, and I think there are a couple of levels that I want to kind of quickly touch on. One is leadership, and I'm starting with that because I think that's critically important, because ultimately what I see happening in nonprofit organizations who are thinking about becoming a data institution is it's a change management process. A lot of organizations think I have a data analytics team and that's enough, and I have like 3 people sitting there. But no, that's not sufficient. I mean, it is something that needs to really be woven into kind of the fabric of the full organization. Kasia already talked about acquiring, retaining talent. Again, it's not sufficient to have one data scientist, but the question is, what is the team that an organization needs, and how can it fund that team and kind of have enough kind of interesting work to retain that team? I think that's one of the biggest challenges of all. The funding. I think we are one of the few funders who provide support towards infrastructure, in a way, the back of the house. And a lot of funders are interested in providing support for an exciting data science project, but not for kind of sustainable infrastructure. How can the less sexy parts of the whole endeavor. And I think the last point that I want to highlight, because I feel we don't talk about it often enough, are the users. So you can build a data institution, you can have that existing network that you potentially could bring along, but I think a lot of organizations, what they are seeing might be on their way to become data institutions, that the surrounding universe of nonprofits, they don't have the capacity yet. And they don't, so what are the things that data institutions can do to build capacity or to package data in a different way. I think we need to think a lot more about kind of pre-packaging of analysis that can be used by much smaller grassroots advocacy organizations. What do they need and how can this be made available?
So I'm really interested in the point that you made there about the kind of change management process that the organizations need to go through, because as you say, like, existing organizations already have some funding models, they already have a community, but they're often then suggesting doing something different, right? In particular, that piece about the connection to the community, what kind of support do they need in order to change their relationship in some ways to the communities that they've been serving?
Yeah, I think that those are two pieces. One is the piece around what is their data vision. I feel a lot of organizations that we are talking with that are not yet data institutions, but that have potential to become data institutions. What is their vision? What is their kind of the broader data strategy beyond talking about a specific project? And I think that's a challenge. And how can we equip the leaders of these organizations with the awareness what that means and how to put that in place? That is one. I think from a community perspective, I mean, there are also a couple of aspects. One that comes to mind is, I think, again, what's the education that data institutions and others can provide to their network of, I call them members for now, but could be different constellations as well. Because clearly, if more data is being pooled, that might have might offer significant potential, but might also come with risks. So what is the, what are the, beyond equipping for the use of data, what are some of the broader kind of insights and helps that can be provided, along with what is the representation of the community in these processes. I mean, it feels like we are talking about, three levels of intermediaries in a way. You have the data institution, then you have probably another set of intermediaries that are, more data fluent most times, but are still, they might be the ones that visualize the data, that interact with policymakers maybe at a national level. But then there are the grassroots organizations. And so it's almost a cascade, and what do you offer as kind of help and awareness building and training, I think.
Yeah, I think Kasia touched on that as well, about the narrative and communication with the communities that these data institutions are supposed to be serving and supporting. That feels like something that can be done more generally, perhaps, just raising the awareness of the role of data. I noticed that both of you have, really talked eloquently about what funders, expert advisors can do to support these data institutions. Just wanted to quickly touch on, in particular, the kind of support that governments can also put in place, and perhaps are uniquely positioned to put in place. So the ODI's just published this report looking specifically at what governments can do to support bottom-up data institutions, which I do think is an interesting lens. There are things like the legal structures that are required in order to support rights to portability, rights even to reciprocity, so that you can get data back. And those rights, you need the law to be changed. That was one of the things that we found in our work with Juech, that those rights don't exist in every context, and they are essential for some of these types of data institutions to thrive. There are other things about trust and how much we trust these data institutions, and again, government can play a role in providing a bit of trust and reassurance around the ways that those data institutions operate. So, and that leads me on to my final big question, which is, when we talk about this kind of enabling environment, we often emphasize the encouragement of data institutions and talking about getting them off the ground and supporting them. I think it's useful to just flip that around a little as well. Where do we want to stop data institutions, and are there problematic patterns that we might see emerging and need to put constraints around? What kind of enabling environment do we need in order to stop bad things happening from data institutions? So Kasia, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yes, definitely. I think it's a really great question, because we often preach, about the big tech, about for not thinking through the innovations, about the unintended consequences, and we should avoid doing exactly the same here. This is an innovation space, and there might be unintended consequences. As a matter of fact, we also commissioned research on that. I can send a link later about, we have a whole the scenarios what could go wrong. So I will just mention just a couple of points here. I think there is something to be said about the whole topic of privacy and security. Handling data at scale, even if you're not trying to innovate, is difficult. But if you're trying to add all the parts of the maybe reversible consent, the agency participation, data rights delegation, and so on, I think the kind of sine qua non, what needs to be there, that we can't compromise on privacy and security. That's something that we fought for and we achieved for a while, and that should be rather built upon than compromise in in the process of okay, now we have the data institution, now we're getting as much data as possible. We can talk about open data sets where maybe there is a less of a problem, but still you need to anonymize it in most cases. But often we talk about sensitive data, health data, and so on. So private security is number one. So really not letting go of that part, super important, because having centralized data infrastructure makes them vulnerable also for malicious attacks or even weaponization by authoritarian governance if it's vulnerable populations data, for example. So that point is still very much valid. There's also to be said about consent. So true data stewardship should always be rooted in meaningful consent granted by data subjects. Even if we have a steward, this needs to be really thought through, whether this is right UX in a legal way. And then there is a trust, something that you mentioned already before in the context of regulation. So kind of putting the trust in the data trust, right? I'm aware data trust is just one of the things that we can do, but it's called also trust for a reason. Safeguards and oversight for the stewards and the intermediaries needs to be there, and they cannot just be a matter of agreement, unbinding agreement, but I believe there should be actual legal frameworks, legal enshrinement, regulation about the certifications and so on, so that we ensure that they really act in the best interest of the data subjects. So there is that, and of course there is I think the controversial topic of the incentives around the commodification of data and the monetization. There are also some initiatives around along the lines of big tech has benefited so long for your data, now it's your time to benefit from your data, we're going to pay out. If you give your data, we're going to pay you for it, and then sell it to advertisers, let's say, or third parties. So I think that's something to watch out for. This is not to say that any kind of monetary benefit is something bad. I think there's just a debate to be had about how and why and for what purpose and which dynamics does that create. So there's that. There's also, I guess, an aspect around if we have an open data sets and then there'll be an open source algorithm based on that. What can happen in the future is still the original purpose of what this data set was created for can be then misused for an algorithm, say health data can be then misused for some kind of, if it's then open source, an algorithm can be misused for an insurance use case and so on. That's something also to think through, how do we avoid that from happening? And I guess I have a couple of more ideas, and as I said, we have this research paper, but I'll put the link there, but I'll stop here just so that my colleague can add to it.
Yeah, Claudia, is there anything that you'd like to add to that list?
Two things, maybe. One is that we talked a little bit about data institutions, and I feel from our conversation that could seem well, they are the expert organizations. I mean, they're the counterweight to big tech, and all of that is to some extent true, but they are also one voice in an ecosystem, especially if they are serving a global sector, for example, with as a data institution. And so this question of, bias, we know bias never completely goes away. We can only reduce bias, but the more perspectives we bring to the table. I feel in a lot of data institutions that I see today, they are shaped by researchers and technologists, and so bringing in the voice of community, bringing in kind of the people that would be mainly affected by the decisions that are made based on the data, and bring those in the design, in kind of how data are being collected, being used, I think is critical. And for that, we probably need to continue to raise the bar that data institutions are meeting, and not assume just good intent. I mean, I'm maybe kind of pushing it a little bit here, but I think the second piece, also not a new point, but I think still an important point, is it's a new sector. There's a lot of experimentation, but ultimately we experiment with data that can be kind of a characterization of real people, and there could be real harm if people if misused, and so there are kind of a lot of sandbox experiments that are underway, and how can we de-risk those, but also how can we accelerate those, because ultimately I think we want to get to the sustainable use of data for positive impact.
Yeah, very good. And yeah, that makes me also think about the kind of role of simply collecting understanding about the way in which data institutions are operating, what's working, what isn't working, the impacts, positive and negative, is in itself an important activity that we need in our enabling environment, so that we learn more quickly, right? And so that we correct more quickly as we're experimenting in this space. So we are like practically out of time. Thank you very much for this really wonderful discussion. But before we finish, I'd just like to invite each of you to give like a tweet length summary of the main thing you want the audience to take away from what we've talked about today. Kasia, can I come to you first for that?
Yeah, sure. I think we're trying to change a paradigm here, a paradigm of how data is governed and how power is distributed. And in order, there is already an ecosystem out there, a very powerful one with like millions of dollars and a big support system. We really need to act together to create an alternative ecosystem to change things.
Thank you, Kasia. Inspirational. Thank you. Claudia.
There's huge potential for existing nonprofit organizations to become data institutions and to really model good behavior, how the benefit of data can be harnessed while the risks are mitigated.
Excellent. And I think a real role for funders, you know, you're really leading the way in this to provide that challenge to help move those organizations to that space. So thank you again. Thank you so much for that discussion.